My name is Iain Tolhurst, and it's IAIN TOLHURST.
And a lot of people call
MBE.
MBE, indeed.
I almost never use it, you know. I forget about it. I'm supposed to do something with it occasionally, you know.
So that happened last year, wasn't it? You met the king.
Yes, I met the king last year. I have met him before in connection with organic farming, twice in fact. But it's really nice to go and meet him at home.
And you were recognised, as you say, for your work in organic farming. And the stuff that you're doing here is pretty much unique. It's completely your own plan, your own scheme of how you go about doing things. Lots of other people are interested in it, and a few other places have started to copy elements of it. But fundamentally, this is all your own creation.
The system, I think, is fair to say. There's parts of it which already existed that other people developed, so I've taken some of that. This is what evolution is about, surely, you know, intellectual evolution. So I've taken some of what other people have done in the past, but I've also added my own dimension and brought it under a complete systems approach to food production, looking very much at the detail of that in terms of its biological importance.
So if you could sum it up then in 30 seconds, what is it you're actually trying to do here?
Right, I don't think I've ever had to sum it up in 30 seconds, so this is going to be a challenge. I think what we're trying to do here is we are producing food at the lowest environmental impact without trashing the planet, but also ensuring that we can maintain and increase biodiversity.
You did it. There we go. It was possible.
I left a few bits out, you know, because it's too comprehensive to get into 30 seconds, but... Yes, it's quite a big story.
Because nature is something that is absolutely at your core, isn't it? That as a kid, you grew up sort of Bristol direction and you loved nature right from the off as a little boy.
Yeah, I was brought up on the very edge of Bristol, on the western side of Bristol, very close to open fields. So I was just a few minutes away from fields, and it was quite an industrial part of Bristol, but I had access to green spaces, which I loved, and I spent a lot of time there. I wasn't supposed to be there a lot of the time. I was not allowed there, actually. But I did go there, and that got me really interested in nature. And I'd always played in the garden. I loved the garden. I loved playing with worms, and I even did a bit of growing as quite a young child. I had a small garden. So I've always had that kind of desire to be connected closely to nature.
So when you went through various different iterations in your life before you actually started doing this, but when you started doing farming properly, you were determined to actually make sure that nature was part of that right from the off.
Yes, I don't think I was quite as conscious as that. I certainly wanted to do it and not damage nature in the process. And I think the rest has evolved from that. So my big concern really was about bird life. So I suppose it was a single issue thing about the way bird life was being treated in the UK by agriculture. So it's really my concerns about bird life that got me to this point now. But now I look at the whole of biodiversity rather than just bird life, because obviously it's all interconnected.
So in terms of the system that you've got here, what is it that you're actually doing? Because it's primarily vegetables, a little bit of fruit, but primarily vegetables that you're growing here. And it's dozens and dozens of different varieties all crammed into really quite a small space.
Yes, well, we are trying to produce enough vegetables to give a person or a family a decent sort of diet in terms of its range and availability throughout the whole year. So we are feeding people. That's what we do.
And it's what, 15 odd acres that you're actually growing on?
Well, we have the total farm is just under 20 acres, but in actual growing space we have about 15 acres, of which we're using 10 all the time for vegetable production, and that's feeding around 250 families about 50% of their total vegetable requirements. Nice. The rest they're buying in out of season produce, obviously things we don't grow in the winter.
Okay. Are you quite proud of the fact that you're managing to genuinely produce that amount of food out of this quite a small space?
Yeah, I've never thought about it as being proud, but I guess so. Yeah, I am. Yes, I suppose I am. Yes, we, and not just me, my whole team. Yes, we are proud of that. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So in terms of the way that the system works, because the point of what you do is that you don't put nitrates on, you don't use pesticides, you don't use fertilisers from outside. You're kind of self-contained, and yet you're managing to get high yields out the ground and be kind to wildlife at the same time. It's sort of like an almost magical win-win-win situation.
Pretty much, yeah. So we've excluded all forms of fertiliser, including organic ones. No chemical sprays, no chemicals at all on the farm, because we are organic and we're not allowed to use chemicals, but no organic materials either, which may be allowed. There are organic things you can use against certain pests. We don't use those either. No fertilisers of any type, even organic ones. We don't import any animal manures or any organic material from other people's land. We do have a little bit of tree waste coming in from local gardens, but that's the only thing coming into the farm. The rest we produce ourselves. So we've pretty much ring-fenced the farm from any external inputs, apart from things like fuel, of course, electricity and seeds, which we obviously need to keep the whole thing running. The farm is probably much more self-sufficient and independent than most other farms of its type. There are a few which would come higher in terms of their lack of dependence on exterior forces.
And is it important to you to do that? I mean, is that like a kind of a self-imposed rule, or what, did it happen accidentally? What?
Yes, it is a self-imposed rule, and I suppose it comes from my original desire in my late youth to be self-sufficient. When I first started having family, I was very young, I was just 20 when I had my first child, and my wife had my first child, we were very much about self-sufficiency and keeping everything within our garden almost at that point. And it's
so is this in the 70s? Were we talking about sort of, the Good Life was on the telly, you were Tom and Barbara?
Yeah, we're talking about 70s, early 70s here, when self-sufficiency was kind of a new thing. No, it wasn't new, but it was newly invented, if you like, for TV, and there was people like John Seymour who wrote quite a lot of books on self-sufficiency, so we kind of followed that stuff for a while. And I realised that self-sufficiency was actually probably incredibly selfish and completely impractical anyway. But I still maintain many of those kind of philosophies about maintaining the farm from within itself and not depending on exterior forces. Those exterior inputs may not always be available. In fact, they are becoming less available, particularly things like, we think about nitrogen fertiliser, which is hugely expensive. We save a vast amount of money by not having to use nitrogen fertiliser. We save a vast amount of money by not having to buy chemicals. We have to manage other things, and there are some costs involved in that, and mostly human labour costs, which is fine. We want people to be working on the land. So we have replaced some of those chemicals with some element of human labour. We do have machinery, we have tractors, we have quite state-of-the-art irrigation equipment. We do have modern technology, of course. We still need to have that. But, the philosophy really is trying to maintain the farm as much as possible from within itself. So fertility is very much about fertility, which is already there, locked up on the farm, in the soil, and all we need to release it is the right fungal activity, and that's what we're doing. So the fertility cycle in the field is primarily one about encouraging the right degree of fungal activity.
So really you're farming fungus and everything else is a byproduct?
Pretty much. The fungi, they are there in their trillions and more than trillions. You couldn't possibly count them. They are the main driver of soil fertility, and all we're doing is managing them and unlocking them, and we are feeding them.
And so what's your magic ingredient on that is literally green stuff? Wood chippings and other stuff that's grown and then ploughed back into the soil, and then everything comes from that.
That's right. The magic ingredient is plant-based. It doesn't depend on chemical fertiliser. It doesn't depend on fertility from animals, which is often coming from somewhere else on the planet. So it's very much about using plant-based materials. So we're using a whole range of green manures. We're using trees. We have a lot of trees on the farm. We've introduced more trees. So we have nearly 20% of the farm is now in trees, and that's providing carbon, which is essential, of course, but also providing not just the carbon, it's providing the fungal activity which the soil needs. So we're replacing our soil's very denatured and denuded element of many hundreds of years of bad agriculture, replacing it with the fungi which would have been there originally when it was taken from woodland. So we are replacing those woodland fungi. We are reintroducing woodland to agriculture to bring that essential fungal element in.
Because the actual soil here, the original soil, when you moved onto this bit of land 30, 40 years ago, whenever it was, it's not great soil, is it?
No, it's very low grade soil. In fact, one of our fields is grade 4, which most people would be horrified growing vegetables on grade 4. As you can see, we've grown some pretty good crops on that grade 4. It was also badly. It had been raped, for want of a better word. The fertility had been mined. Much of it had been exported in hay. So there's massive hay crops for many, many years. During the war, it got a real hammering. It got potatoes every year almost for the duration of the war. It had a pretty rough time. Nothing much was put back, and it was in a really pretty bad state when we took it on. It took quite a few years to get that back, that health back. So the whole system of the farm is really based on the importance of soil health, and the way we manage that is through natural systems.
And in terms then of the way that impacts the wildlife of the area, and bear in mind, that you were a bird enthusiast as a young person, you still love birds and wildlife now, and you wanted. How has that actually impacted on the land around here? What kind of wildlife do you actually see?
Yeah, we see a lot. I mean, we have been monitoring this. We've had some fairly regular data collection over many years. We've seen a real increase in bird species, fantastic increase in moth and caterpillar species, and just every species in general has increased. But we are quite a small oasis amongst a much wider farming environment, and obviously we hope that some of what we produce here will move on to other places. Mm-hmm. So the idea that farms will join up and become wildlife areas, I think, is very important. We need these little oases to make sure we have the parent material to go on into other parts of agricultural lands.
So as we wander around the farm and have a look about the place, what are the birds, what are the animals, what are the insects that kind of really make you smile when you see them?
Well, I think the insects are the most interesting ones, actually, because they're so diverse, they're so adaptable, and they can put up with anything. But the birds are easy to see, easy to recognise. The earthworms are a really important one for us, because through the earthworm population we can monitor soil health quite easily. We don't need to have high tech solutions to monitoring that. It's a simple process, and we can see big increases in earthworm population.
So you literally dig a bucket full out and count how many worms are in it?
Yeah, pretty much. We have a certain small area. It's 20 by 20 by 20 centimetres we dig out, and we can count the worms. And we're also looking at different species of worms. We have 7 or 8 species of worms. I never realised there was so many. Also, we're looking at the age of the worms. This is very important. So you can tell an awful lot about the quality and health of your soil through the earthworm population.
Okay, so how healthy is your soil? What is your earthworm population?
Right. Well, at its best, it varies depending on where we are within the rotation, but at its best, we're around 15 million per hectare.
That's a lot of worms.
And we've tried to put a kind of a weight figure on that. It's very difficult. I haven't really come up with anything which I think is accurate, but we're looking at around 10 tonnes of earthworms per hectare.
Right, okay.
Per square metre, in terms of numbers, this is 1,500 earthworms per square metre.
And in terms of what the worms actually do then, because they're an indicator of soil health, but they actually create the soil down there. They're the ones that are pulling the debris down from the ground below the soil, and what they excrete is what is effectively soil. Is that right?
Absolutely, they are building soil. We've tried to see if we can actually measure how much new soil we're building every year. It is possible, although it's quite complex. We do know they are building new soil every year. You can see it in the winter and spring. You can see new layer of soil. It's a millimetre or two thick on the surface, so we know it's happening. And they are doing that through plants. So, we're feeding the worms through plants. We're growing the plants as either crop residues or more, so it tends to be green manures, which we're growing specifically to feed the soil and to feed the earthworms. And those crops, obviously, those green manure crops are coming from the action of the photosynthesis of the sun and what they can extract from the soil. So we have a complete cycle. So we're potentially increasing carbon levels through photosynthesis and allowing the earthworms to do that final processing.
And ultimately, you are producing decent quantities of crop, which you're selling locally. So that's sort of within kind of 10 miles or so. Most of your stuff goes pretty locally. So that keeps your carbon footprint very low as well. In terms of the way that other farmers might look at what you're doing and thinking, well, maybe they're onto something there. What would be like the one thing you would want another farmer to take from what you're doing and start incorporating into the way that they normally farm commercially?
It's difficult to point to one particular thing, because the whole system is about the interdependence of all the different components. It's like a computer. If you take one bit out, the whole thing fails. Yeah. It's like a car. You remove the starter motor or the carburetor and it just will not function. So the difficulty is for other farmers to adopt this is they have to adopt the whole system. And this is a challenging thing to do. It is possible, and I do help farmers to do that. But it means you have to really go back to square one and start again. There's a financial cost in doing that, of course, in terms of, you may not be able to continue cropping your farm in the same way for a period of time while you go through this transition period. The one thing, if there was one thing, it would really to be absolutely conscious about how your actions on the farm impact on nature and how that is going to impact on the viability of your farm in terms of being able to maintain a long-term, sustainable, viable food production place. It's as simple as that. If we don't look after nature, we are seriously challenging our ability to feed ourselves. This is already showing up in many parts of the world. So it's really about getting back to nature. We have to forget some of the science we've learned and look more at the biology. And if we look at the way farmers have been treating soil up till 10 years ago, it was all a science, chemical-based treatment. Now there is a real move. Farmers are becoming aware of the biological function of soil. They are thinking about the biological function of soil. They are thinking differently in how they're going to manage their soils. We have made a huge leap forward in consciousness about soil, because up till 10 years or so ago, soil was just a place to anchor a crop, and you just fed it chemicals from somewhere else. That thinking is changing, and we've been able to show on our farm that you can take that to the complete extreme and make your farm completely self-sufficient in terms of nutrients. We don't need to be bringing in anything from outside at all once you get the system right. And in doing that, we also preserve all the natural functions of biological diversity, which we all depend on. Every single insect has a particular role to play. They are all important to us as a species. We may find wasps irritating, but they have an enormous important role to play in the biological function of nature. So it's really about getting back to nature, and we are so removed in this country. We have no history of farming in my family or yours or anybody else's at all for 3 or 4 generations, and even more in many places. The Industrial Revolution swept all that away, and we need to reinstate that, and we need to honour how important nature really is in this process.
And given the fact that you've been running the farm for 50 odd years now, and that you've got a lot of experience and a lot of quite a high viewpoint, if you like, on how things have changed over time. Are you currently more or less optimistic about the direction we're headed in than we were maybe 10 years ago?
In some ways, I am optimistic. If you're a farmer, you have to be. You have to be optimistic. In other ways, I am pessimistic about the future, and I have seen the degradation of the environment, particularly in this country. We have the least biological species in this country just about anywhere in the world, and it's because of the way that farming has progressed, post-industrial revolution. There are still plenty of people who think this is still the only way to go forward. They're not really thinking about food production long term. So I am worried about some of these trends. The really difficult part about all this, and the bit that really most people don't want to talk about, the elephant in the room, is the financial implications of doing this. And to grow food properly is going to cost more than it does now. And there's no easy way around that. We have to accept that food production is a national service. It is a public good. It needs to be done. It's going to have to be supported by government at some level. It has been supported, but often it's supported in the wrong type of agriculture. It's produced, in the past, massive mountains of food that nobody could use, and is now still producing environmental damage on a huge scale. That has to change. We have to divert that money, which I don't think is ever going to be more than it is now, but we have to divert that into a way which is better spent in terms of looking after the biological function of soil, but still producing food. And I think our farm offers some of the possible solutions to doing that. The other big elephant in the room is the predominance of livestock in our agricultural systems, which has increased enormously since the war. It's gone up dramatically. all the major investigations and reports into global food security have come down with the same mantra, and that is we have to reduce livestock numbers. There is no question. Very few people now can argue against that. It's become much more difficult. So we do accept and we do realise that production of livestock will have to fall. It will have to come down to a level which is sustainable in the long term. And at the moment, so much food is being fed to livestock. If we look at UK as an example, over 65% of all the cereals we see growing are going direct to livestock. And we lose a huge value of that food.
Yeah.
We lose a massive value of potential of that food. That is going to have to change. Livestock are no longer going to be able to consume vast amounts of cereal. The cereal is going to go to feeding people. And much of the land that would be released from that would still be livestock, but on a smaller scale. They wouldn't be any factory farmed. It would be outdoor livestock only. It would be a much reduced level to what it is now. It would release a huge amount of land, which could be given back to nature. So it could be, it could be repurposed for nature's needs, which we need to do in order to save the environmental planet.
Well, Iain, it's been an absolute pleasure to get the opportunity to have a wander around the farm and look at what you do here. It is a unique place. It's a lovely place to be. You're quite an inspiring chap. It's well, as you know, you get hundreds of people come here every year to actually learn what you're doing and to see what you're doing and why you're doing it. Keep going, because you're pushing in the right direction. Stuff is starting to happen.
Yeah, and we're kind of cultivating the next generation, of course, as well, to take on from this. Part of my work is about helping young people. We have volunteers here who come to learn our farm for 3 months, and some of them go off. And you met Maria earlier on. Fantastic example. Somebody's going to go on and do what we've started. So we are trying to look after the next generation, which we are going to be absolutely dependent on. We really are. I won't be around to see what may be the worst of the damage, but I won't be around to see what I hope is going to be the big repair job afterwards, which I'm pretty sure is going to happen, but it may not be in my lifetime. But there's a start of that process now, I think.
Well, we've got to crack on and get on with it, haven't we?
Definitely.
Iain Tolhurst, NBE, thank you very much.
My pleasure.